We begin tonight with a one-sentence letter that was delivered to the White House at 10:30 this morning. My dear Mr. President, having concluded that it would be in the best interests of the court to have my successor appointed and confirmed well in advance of the commencement of the court's next term, I shall retire from regular active service as an Associate Justice. Most respectfully yours, John Paul Stevens. 11 days before his 90th birthday, the oldest member of the United States Supreme Court, Justice John Paul Stevens, officially announces today that he is stepping down. His retirement, not exactly a surprise. It had been speculated upon for weeks now, but today the justice made it official. When the letter arrived at the White House this morning, its intended recipient was on board Air Force One. Once President Obama returned to the White House today, he gave some early insight into what he's going to be looking for in a replacement for Justice Stevens.
I view the process of selecting a Supreme Court nominee as among my most serious responsibilities as president. And while we cannot replace Justice Stevens' experience or wisdom, I will seek someone in the coming weeks with similar qualities: an independent mind, a record of excellence and integrity, a fierce dedication to the rule of law, and a keen understanding of how the law affects the daily lives of the American people. It will also be someone who, like Justice Stevens, knows that in a democracy, powerful interests must not be allowed to drown out the voices of ordinary citizens.
Just about immediately, Senate Republicans started to give indications that they're gearing up for a big fight here.
I've got to say, he has a propensity to choose people who don't care what the law is. They're going to make the law from the bench. Judges are not supposed to do that. And I personally am very upset about it.
Except, of course, in the Citizens United case, where the court totally made up the law. But that was in a good way, right, Senator? In addition to those in the Senate who will actually decide the fate of President Obama's judicial nominee, there is also a whole industry in Washington that exists solely for days like this. It exists to not only fight over Supreme Court nominations, but to raise as much money as possible off of nomination fights. It's a Washington machine that, it's weird. It lies semi-dormant for years, and then it awakens every time there's a Supreme Court vacancy. And all of a sudden, right now, you can consider that machine woken up and cranked up. The conservative group Judicial Watch blasting out a statement today warning that if President Obama nominates a, quote, empathetic liberal judicial activist, he will have a fight on his hands. They didn't include an emoticon of themselves rubbing their hands in glee at that possibility, but it was implied. With a simple one-sentence letter delivered to the White House at 10:30 this morning, Supreme Court confirmation season has officially begun. And among all Washington political events, not much tops Supreme Court confirmation hearings in terms of unrestrained, over-the-top, civic-minded drama. It wasn't always this way. Nominees weren't even always required to publicly testify on their own behalf. The first one to do so was Harlan Fiske Stone. He was nominated by Calvin Coolidge in 1925. It wasn't until the 50s that nominees regularly began testifying publicly like they do now. And it wasn't until the 80s and the advent of nationally televised multi-day hearings that things really got rolling in terms of the political drama. On July 1st, 1987, Ronald Reagan nominated Circuit Court Judge Robert Bork to fill the vacancy that had just been created on the Supreme Court. Within 45 minutes of the Bork nomination, 45 minutes, Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy stormed onto the Senate floor to declare Judge Bork's nomination essentially dead on arrival.
Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, and school children could not be taught about evolution.
That's 45 minutes into the nomination process. How's that for opposition? Mr. Bork was, in fact, one of the most radical jurists ever proposed in modern times for any judgeship, let alone for the Supreme Court. The fight to keep him off the court set new standards for how these things are fought. People for the American Way enlisted Gregory Peck, the Hollywood legend, in the fight against Bork.
There's a special feeling of awe people get when they visit the Supreme Court of the United States, the ultimate guardian of our rights as Americans. That's why we set the highest standards for our highest court justices, and that's why we're so concerned. This is Gregory Peck. Robert Bork wants to be a Supreme Court justice. But the record shows that he has a strange idea of what justice is. He defended poll taxes and literacy tests, which kept many Americans from voting. Please urge your senators to vote against the Bork nomination, because if Robert Bork wins his seat on the Supreme Court, it will be for life, his life and yours.
Robert Bork ultimately made it through his tumultuous confirmation hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee. But the opposition did not let up as the nomination left the committee and headed for the Senate floor.
In Robert Bork's America, there is no room at the inn for blacks and no place in the Constitution for women. And in our America, there should be no seat on the Supreme Court for Robert Bork.
Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court was eventually voted down on the floor of the Senate, with 58 senators voting against him, including 6 Republicans. Rivaling Judge Bork in terms of pure drama were the confirmation hearings for Judge Clarence Thomas in 1991. His confirmation process was going along sort of swimmingly until news reports leaked that one of his former employees made statements to the FBI accusing him of sexual harassment. That accusation and the treatment in the Senate of the accuser and the accused made the Clarence Thomas confirmation into some of the most riveting television ever filmed in a Senate committee room. It made Clarence Thomas a right-wing hero and Anita Hill a 2-word explanation for a generation of women being utterly skeeved out by politics.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, this is what will happen to you. You will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree.
Professor Hill, you said that you took it to mean that Judge Thomas wanted to have sex with you, but in fact, he never did ask you to have sex, correct?
No, he did not ask me to have sex. He did continually pressure me to go out with him, continually, and he would not accept my explanation as one as being valid.
Clarence Thomas squeaked out of the Senate Judiciary Committee on a 7-7 split vote. He was then narrowly confirmed by the Senate 2 weeks later. That was not how things went for President George W. Bush's second nominee to the Supreme Court after John Roberts.
This morning, I'm proud to announce that I'm nominating Harriet Ellen Myers to serve as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. She has devoted her life to the rule of law and the cause of justice. She will be an outstanding addition to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Exactly 24 days later, Harriet Ellen Myers withdrew that nomination to the Supreme Court after undergoing a barrage of criticism from all corners of the political world. For all of the drama and passion and raw emotion that comes out of the Supreme Court nomination process, you know what doesn't happen? Supreme Court nominees don't get filibustered. For as partisan as these nomination fights can get, filibustering really just isn't part of it. In the entire history of Supreme Court nominations throughout the years, exactly one judge has ever been successfully filibustered. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson wanted to elevate Abe Fortas from being an associate justice on the court to being the chief justice of the court. Mr. Fortas was filibustered. He was not allowed to become chief justice, and the very next year he resigned from the court under threat of impeachment for having done stuff like accepting thousands of dollars in outside payments on top of his Supreme Court salary. In other words, Abe Fortas was really not your typical case. Aside from Abe Fortas in 1968, nobody ever gets filibustered. Sometimes nominees don't get confirmed by the Senate. Sometimes nominees do get confirmed, but only after undergoing a brutal confirmation process. Sometimes nominees withdraw before even making it to the Senate Judiciary Committee so the brutal nomination process can begin. But by and large, Supreme Court nominees are given the deference of an up or down vote on their nomination. They are not filibustered. As much as this seems like a process that can't possibly get any more polarized, it can't get any more exploited, it can't be any more partisan, it is now, in 2010, officially more polarized polarized, more exploited, and more partisan than it has ever been before. And you can tell that because Republican members of the Senate are already threatening to filibuster the nominee to replace Justice Stevens, even though there isn't even a nominee yet. Just minutes after President Obama accepted Justice Stevens' resignation today, Republican Senator Lamar Alexander released a statement that reads, quote, "I hope President Obama will nominate his successor from the middle and not from the fringe. In truly extraordinary cases, I reserve the prerogative to vote no on confirmation or even to vote to deny an up or down vote." Just saying, I might filibuster. I'm already thinking about it. Same goes for his Republican colleague, John Kyle of Arizona.
Are you willing to pledge right now that the GOP will not filibuster whoever the president nominates?
It'll all depend on what kind of a person